I'll be so glad
When
when the sun go down.
when the sun go
I'll
down,
be so glad
uh-huh.
when the sun goes.
During the mid to late 1800s, Tennessee was faced with many new problems. In 1866, the Tennessee state government adopted a controversial program known as the convict lease system. Tennessee was faced with the daunting task of fixing one of the biggest problems surrounding the state at the time, finding something to do with the prisoners, a way to make the prisons self-sufficient, and finding a way to fix the mounting state debt. The Tennessee convict lease system was nothing more than a legalized slave system that used mostly blacks as the hand of their labor. Having to rely mostly on natural resources to keep the economy afloat after the Civil War, Tennessee had turned to the coal industry, amongst others. They had to resort to convict labor because they were in debt and couldn't afford to pay to house or feed the growing prison populations, especially considering that the state penitentiary was destroyed during the Civil War. Because of abuse, lack of sufficient training, or any training at all for that matter, on top of the poor care that the convicts received, death rates amongst the prisoners were around 10 times higher than those convicts in non-lease states.
They needed cheap labor. It seems that the state of Tennessee had gone into debt. They had borrowed a lot of money, sold a lot of bonds, and they needed to pay them off. And the easiest way to do that was to lease, that is to rent out their convicts for labor to big corporations. And the biggest corporation of them all in Tennessee was the Tennessee Coal and Iron Corporation. And so they decided that's what they do. And so the coal mine operators got a good deal, and the state of Tennessee got a good deal. The convicts didn't.
The first convicts released to furniture makers in July of 1866. With the new infusion of cheap labor and not having to house or feed the prisoners, Tennessee's state government finally began to start paying off some of the state debt. But this was very controversial because of the way these convict laborers began to take the jobs of free miners and free laborers. This frustration came to a head for the first time in January of 1871 in Tracy City, where the first revolt against the lease system occurred. The whites were protesting for higher wages and an end to the system. They then mounted an assault on the guards in an attempt to stop the convicts from working, but in the end, the violence only served as a loss for the miners and a win for the company. In 1884, the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company leased the prisoners of the state penitentiary for $101,000 per year. In 1889, the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company then achieved the ability to sublease these same prisoners to other companies. In the same year, they began subleasing 60% of the prisoners for over $100,000 per year. Something that shouldn't get lost in this time in Tennessee history in regards to the convict leasing system was that most of these convicts were in fact African Americans. Because of the Jim Crow laws at the time, which added to the prison population by bringing even more blacks into the prisons for petty crimes such as looking a white woman in her eyes or not giving way on the sidewalk. The zebra law was also a low point concerning the system. This zebra law put convicts in white and black stripes that we all know of today, as well as enabled the use of so-called chain gangs, and allowed the guards to harshly discipline the prisoners. Punishment included severe beatings and whippings. Not only were the punishments severe, but the sanitation at the campsites and stockades were non-existent. Food was scarce, and the inmates were subjugated to inexcusable degradation and unspeakable conditions. They were also forced to work and sleep in the same clothes, and many of which didn't even have any shoes. The next challenge to the system occurred on July 14, 1891, when free miners launched assaults in Anderson County at Briceville. The nearly 300 miners surrounded the stockade taking control of the 40-some prisoners and guards, forcing them to march to Coal Creek 5 miles away. They then proceeded to seal them in boxcars and send them to Knoxville in an attempt to get Governor Buchanan to meet with them in an attempt to protect the rights of the free miners. Upset that the price per ton of coal had fallen from $1.25 to just 50 cents per ton, the miners were enraged and demanded that something be done to protect their rights. The governor responded by summoning 3 state militia companies to restore order and return the prisoners, and then advised the miners to use the court systems to air their grievances. Not happy by this action, the free miners repeated the same thing a mere 6 days later, forcing Governor Buchanan's hand, making him call a special session of legislature to discuss the issue. The General Assembly responded by enhancing the governor's power to act against insurrectionists, but also resolved to abolish the system once the contract expired in 1896. This was far from the resolution that the miners wanted. On October 31st, miners again surrounded the stockade, releasing the prisoners into the surrounding hills and valleys, and then burning the stockades and buildings 2 days later at the Cumberland Mine in Oliver Springs. These convicts were returned in late December under guard of the militia once Governor Buchanan issued martial law. In Grundy County on August 2, 1892, miners revolted against 2 sites in Tracy and Inman cities, sparking new revolts in Anderson County, forcing the outnumbered militia to surrender, again shipping these convicts and guards to Knoxville before, once again, burning the stockades. Problems were beginning to become so severe that even the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company acknowledged that they might have not made the best decision and said they would never employ convict labor again. The final revolt led to several important results, including the loss of public support for the free miners. In 1893, the General Assembly, feeling the pressure, passed legislation for a new state penitentiary and reinforced the thought that abolishing the system would occur in 1896 when the contract ended. With the end of the lease system, Brushy Mountain State Prison became the state's new penitentiary where the convicts were to be housed. This, in turn, brought an end to the tough time in Tennessee history that was encompassed by mass hysteria, violence, declarations of martial law, horrible treatment of prisoners, and unspeakable atrocities against blacks and the other prisoners that were forced to work in horrific conditions and endure through such a black spot in Tennessee's past. What do you think was the biggest turning point or the action that turned the tide in the coal miners' favor, or what event was most important in the eventual abolishment of this lease system?
I think if you can consider the entire coal miners' war from 91 to 93 to be a single event, that would be it. It just was too expensive for the state to try and fight the miners. And so they decided that they would finally give in and really pass some legislation that would abolish the convict slave system. They set up a system whereby convicts would mine coal at Brushy Mountain, and that was the only place that they do it. And it was for the state to use the coal.
Okay. Tennessee became the first state to abolish the convict lease system, and its duration of only 30 years was relatively brief compared to that of some other southern states. After the miners regained their jobs, not only did the level of output begin to increase once again, but the more skilled and sufficiently trained miners began to have their lives valued as well, and not only the production that they were getting out on a given day.
I'll be so glad when
When
the sun goes down.
when the sun go
I'll
down,
be so glad when
uh-huh.
the sun goes down.
When the sun go down,
Ain't all that's leaving, but
uh-huh.
I'm gonna lie down.
But don't wanna lie
I
down.
ain't all that sleepy, but I
Uh-huh.
wanna lie down.
Just don't wanna lie
I
down.
wanna lie down.
Oh,
I
yeah.
wanna lie down.
Just don't wanna lie
I
down.
ain't all that sleepy, but I
Uh-huh.
wanna lie.
Oh, well, I said, it told his David, won't you go out and bring me leather? Well, I said, won't you go out and bring me leather? Or bring him dead or alive. Lord, Lord, bring him dead or alive. Oh, well, the deputy, he told I said, well, I ain't gonna mess with leather. Oh, well, the deputy, he told the high sheriff, says I ain't gonna.
I'll be so glad when
Well,
the sun goes down.
when the sun go
I'll
down.
be so glad when
Uh-huh.
Oh, well, the high sheriff, he told his deputy,